A flight attendant tried to disrespect a black CEO, but he had no idea the moment would go viral on social media, exposing the crew's misconduct to the world. A flight attendant yanked a black CEO's braids so hard one snapped. Thinking the humiliation would stay quiet, he didn't realize every pull was being recorded and would blow up across the entire media within hours. The moment that braid broke, so did his career. Subscribe if you believe arrogance always collapses when real strength stands tall. Arion Dresmor knew the flicker of contempt when he saw it. It flashed across the flight attendant's face, just for a second, as he passed the galley and turned into the narrow corridor of first class. No words were exchanged. No gesture was made. But the look struck Arion like a whispered insult. Quiet, deniable, but precise. It wasn't the first time he'd walked into a room carrying both legacy and expectation on his shoulders. Still, something in that man's eyes stirred caution. Arion kept moving, his steps measured, his expression composed. He took his seat in setting his briefcase, a matte black case with biometric locks, gently beneath the seat in front of him. Inside it rested one of the industry's most sensitive data sets, a complete AI-driven flight safety simulation designed to reform aviation protocols across 4 continents. He wasn't here for attention. He was here for accountability. As he adjusted his jacket and leaned back into the leather, the cabin buzzed with the last-minute shuffle of boarding. The whir of overhead bins, the clatter of heels against flooring, the standard airline murmur. Arion, 41, had flown enough to read more than safety placards. He read the room. The way the attendant, the one with the name tag, Naren Vask, hovered just slightly longer near every other passenger. The way his steps stiffened near Arion's row, then softened 2 aisles down. Subtle. Calculated. Arion didn't flinch. He simply tucked a single braid behind his ear and whispered to himself, "Not tonight." He had been underestimated in boardrooms, dismissed in contract negotiations, mistranslated in headlines that celebrated his success but stripped his identity of texture. But here, in the sealed environment of a jet cabin, the game was different. Smaller stage, tighter audience, sharper consequences. Naren returned down the aisle moments later, performing the cabin check with robotic efficiency. His gaze passed over Arion like fog, neither landing nor acknowledging. Noted, Arion didn't move. He had learned long ago that sometimes the most strategic stance was stillness. The pre-flight announcements rolled, and the cabin lights dimmed into an amber glow. Outside, the tarmac of Durham Field blurred under the pull of acceleration. Engines roared. The aircraft lifted. Alcheron Flight 718 was airborne. 12 minutes into the ascent, the first subtle move came. "Would you like a beverage, sir?" Naren asked the passenger in 1B. "Sparkling water, please," the man replied. "Of course." Naren retrieved it smoothly, passed it over, then moved on, skipping Arion entirely. Arion waited, thinking perhaps it was an oversight. But the same thing happened with the next service card. A young crew member, barely out of training, by the look of him, walked past with a tray of warm towels. Arion raised his hand lightly. "Could I have one of those, please?" The boy hesitated and looked toward Naren. Before the junior attendant could respond, Naren stepped in and spoke firmly. "We're out, sir." Arion nodded slowly. Moments later, the same boy offered a towel to another man across the aisle. Arion saw it. So did others. Eyes flicked toward him, then away. Pretending not to see became harder by the minute. He exhaled slowly and reached beneath his lapel. From a slim, nearly invisible groove in his executive badge, he triggered the built-in voice recorder. The click was silent. A glowing dot on the inside of his cuff confirmed it was live. He leaned back, crossing one leg over the other, and opened his tablet. The data simulation loaded slowly, a cascading thread of flight logs and predictive safety maps. But his mind wasn't on the charts. It was on the temperature of the room, the tightening silence, the slight twitch in Naren's jaw every time their eyes almost met. 10 more minutes passed. Then came the calculated move. Naren walked past with a pitcher of water, half full, and a towel slung loosely over his arm. As he passed Arion's row, he dipped slightly, feigned a trip, and splashed water across the edge of Arion's leather briefcase. The reaction was surgical. Arion leaned forward, unlatched the case, and checked the interior. Fortunately, the water had barely kissed the exterior seals. But that wasn't the point. He looked up. "Careful," Arion said quietly, his voice low and steady. "That case holds evidence more valuable than your uniform." Naren said nothing. He kept walking. Several passengers shifted. One, seated near the aisle, had already raised his phone slightly. The camera lens blinked red. Nobody said a word, but the cabin no longer felt airborne. It felt charged. From the cockpit, the seatbelt sign blinked on again. And still, Arion remained composed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand apologies. He simply reopened his tablet, tapped 3 times on the upper corner of the screen, and initiated the backup protocol that streamed the current cabin view via satellite relay to his legal team's secure drive. One stream, one braid, one insult. Sometimes that's all it takes to ground a storm before it ever hits. One choice was all it took to rewrite the flight's trajectory. The moment the beverage cart reached his row, Arion noticed it. Naren Vask didn't look at him. Instead, he poured drinks mechanically for the passenger to Arion's left, then smoothly pushed the cart past him without a word, eyes fixed on the aisle like Arion didn't exist. The omission wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable, sharp in its subtlety. Arion didn't move. His gaze followed the cart, then shifted briefly to Naren's rigid posture. He said nothing, but his hand slowly brushed his executive ID badge, double-tapping its base. The badge gave a faint green blink, recording mode activated. Minutes later, Naren returned down the opposite aisle. Arion sat upright, calm, tablet open across his lap with a flight protocol brief glowing on its surface. He glanced up and asked politely, "May I have a hot towel, please?" Naren paused, the corners of his mouth tight. "We're out," he said flatly, not bothering to disguise the impatience in his tone. Arion nodded once, expression unreadable. Less than 60 seconds later, Naren handed a towel to a passenger directly across the aisle from Arion, a middle-aged man in a beige blazer. The man accepted it gratefully, oblivious to the moment's weight. Arion's eyes narrowed slightly. The gesture was as transparent as it was unnecessary. A few rows ahead, a young man seated near the wing paused mid-sip of his drink, his phone already angled low and recording discreetly. He had caught the interaction. So had others. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the quiet that precedes lightning. 20 minutes into the flight, just as the aircraft leveled from ascent, Naren returned with a waste bag in one hand. "Trash," he muttered, eyes scanning the seats but still avoiding Arion's. Arion shook his head once, and Naren took a half-step forward as if to pass, then stumbled deliberately, just enough of the water cup resting on his tray to tilt. It splashed downward, hitting the floor and spraying droplets on Arion's black leather carry-on. "Watch it," Arion said sharply, his voice still controlled but sharpened by steel. He reached down slowly, retrieving the briefcase and brushing it off with a cloth from his inner jacket. Then he looked up, locking eyes with Naren for the first time. "This case holds evidence more valuable than your uniform," he said evenly. Naren smirked, as if trying to pretend it had been a simple mistake, but there was no apology. He moved on with a flick of the bag, and Arion sat back slowly, placing the now damp case beside his foot. The tension in the cabin tightened like coiled wire. The man with the phone continued to record, now capturing side glances from nearby passengers, one of whom shook his head in disbelief, another whose jaw stiffened behind his trimmed beard. The seatbelt signs remained on. The flight crew made no announcements. The lights dimmed to a soft amber, casting shadows that made each motion seem more dramatic, more intentional. Arion kept his face expressionless, but inside, his mind was calculating. This was no accident. Not the towel, not the snub, not the spill. Naren had an agenda, and he was using the uniform as armor. Arion reviewed the footage discreetly on his tablet. Crystal clear. The towel snub, the smirk, the splash. all synced with the ambient cabin mic from his badge. But what struck him more than the incident itself was the response, or lack of it, from the other crew. Passive, complicit. Not a single male attendant had stepped forward to check on him, despite witnessing at least 2 breaches of service conduct. He reached again for his tablet, tapping a silent relay icon that transferred a live feed to his remote legal team, an encrypted channel built into Dravant's secure executive suite. They'd receive it within seconds. The case was building itself. Arion wasn't reacting emotionally. He didn't need to. He was preparing. Across the aisle, a man in a black fleece leaned toward his seatmate and whispered, "Isn't that the guy from the Dravant acquisition?" His seatmate nodded slightly, whispering back, "Yeah, that's him, Arion Dresmor." From behind, a deeper voice murmured, "Man, they're really testing the wrong dude tonight." The man with the phone looked up at Arion. He caught his eye, lifted his phone slightly, and mouthed, "I've got this." Arion gave a small nod of appreciation and returned his focus to the screen. The footage was time-stamped, high-resolution, and streaming directly to multiple secure servers. He adjusted the volume on his earpiece. Listening to the background audio, he could hear Naren muttering again under his breath a few rows down. He isolated the clip and bookmarked it. 1 row ahead, an older passenger sat back, visibly disturbed, rubbing his chin. He pressed the attendant call button, but canceled it moments later, as if uncertain what to say. Fear of rocking the boat. The cabin wasn't just filled with tension, it was filled with judgment, too. Arion knew this tension well. He'd lived it in boardrooms, conference panels, contract negotiations. But here, at 30,000 feet, with nothing between himself and the subtle hostility but the walls of pressurized steel, it took on a sharper edge. Still, he did not flinch. He sat tall, shoulders squared, gloved finger tapping lightly against the tablet. There was no need to retaliate now. Every second that passed was building a case stronger than any confrontation ever could. Arion reached for a napkin from his seat pocket, blotted the last traces of moisture from his briefcase, and then looked out the window. The sky was smooth, clouds quiet. But the real turbulence was inside the cabin. Not even turbulence had the power to disrupt the cabin like prejudice disguised as professionalism. Midway through the flight, Naren Vast struck. He approached silently, a garbage bag draped over one arm and a forced neutral expression that didn't quite mask the disdain lurking beneath. Arion Dresmor, seated in 1A, didn't look up. His eyes remained on the tablet before him, reviewing simulation models for a summit presentation he had nearly memorized. The hum of the engines masked most sounds, but not the sudden flick of fingers against braided hair. Without warning, Naren reached down, his movement swift, targeted, and deliberate, and yanked one of Arion's long braids with a sharp, aggressive tug. There was an audible snap. The tension in the cabin fractured in a single breath. A gasp escaped from somewhere near row 2C. Another passenger's tray clattered to the floor. The braid, cleanly torn from its tie, hung limp in Naren's hand for a moment before slipping through his fingers and landing on Arion's lap like a severed rope. The silence that followed was unnatural, suspended in disbelief, as if the entire cabin had been momentarily disconnected from the laws of normalcy. Arion did not move. His fingers, still resting on the tablet screen, slowly curled. His chest rose once, controlled. Then, his head lifted, and his gaze met Naren squarely. "You just crossed a line that no uniform can protect," Arion said, his voice low, resonant, and unshaken. Naren blinked. His smirk wavered. He fumbled for an excuse, his tone laced with artificial calm. "Sir, your hair was obstructing the aisle. It's a safety issue. We have grooming standards too." The lie was hollow, and everyone knew it. A man seated diagonally across the aisle, a business traveler in his 40s, stood up. His phone was already recording. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His lens had caught the entire moment. 2 rows behind, another passenger turned to look forward, her brows furrowed in visible discomfort. Whispers began swirling in the air like early turbulence. Arion still hadn't raised his voice. He didn't have to. His authority didn't come from volume. It came from the unbearable weight of clarity. Calmly, he reached for the nearest attendant call button. A chime rang through the cabin. Another flight attendant, younger and visibly rattled, appeared within seconds. "Is there an issue, sir?" he asked cautiously, eyes darting from Arion to the coiled braid in his lap, then to Naren, who now stood awkwardly at an angle, halfway shielded behind the trash bag like a curtain. "Yes," Arion answered. "Lock the footage. I will not let this vanish in turbulence." The attendant hesitated, then gave a short nod and stepped away, radioing something under his breath as he moved toward the galley. What none of the crew realized, however, was that Arion's black tablet had already been streaming the entire flight segment. Not to a cloud server, not to a social feed, but to a private legal console at Dravant Systems. His ID badge, standard issue for executive travel, contained an encrypted audiovisual documentation tool. It synced in real time through a private satellite link tethered to his seat's embedded interface. Every word, every action, every gesture had been captured and archived. Naren's posture stiffened as murmurs built across the cabin like a rising tide. His hands tightened around the trash bag. "I told you," he said weakly to no one in particular. "I was following protocol, but there was no protocol for this. No policy that covered aggression masked as compliance. The cabin wasn't just watching now, they were remembering. Every second was being stored in digital and human memory alike. The air had shifted. No one was pretending anymore." Arion didn't blink. He lowered his tablet to rest gently on his lap beside the fallen braid and took a slow breath through his nose. The sharp line of his jaw remained steady, but the slight narrowing of his eyes signaled what everyone else already sensed. This moment would not be buried. Across the aisle, the man recording lowered his phone just long enough to scribble something on a notepad. Then he tore off the sheet, folded it in half, and extended it across the aisle. Arion opened it with one hand and scanned the QR code printed in black ink. The man nodded. "Secure server," he said quietly. "Time-stamped." Arion gave a single, grateful nod and slid the note into the inside pocket of his suit. He reached down and placed the torn braid into a black envelope from his briefcase, pressing the seal shut. No words, no anger, just movement that felt like preparation, not reaction. Behind the curtain, two crew members huddled in a whisper. One said, "What did he do?" The other only shook his head, pale and silent. In seat one, Arion shifted slightly, adjusting his jacket collar as he gazed out the window. The horizon outside was clean, cloudless, but within the cabin, the storm had already formed. In a world wired for accountability, arrogance always forgets the cloud remembers. Panic rippled through the cabin the instant the braid tore free. The sound wasn't loud, a dry snap and the whisper of shifting fabric, but it cracked through the air like thunder. All eyes turned. The cabin, once filled with quiet conversations and the hum of the engines, fell into an uncanny silence. Arion Dresmor didn't move. He didn't speak. The severed braid lay curled in his lap, stark against the soft texture of his dark suit. He sat upright in seat 1A, his posture dignified, unmoving, but his eyes calm, sharp, unwavering, locked on Naren Vask. The flight attendant, still holding the garbage bag as if the act had never occurred, froze mid-motion. His smug expression wilted instantly under the weight of what he had just done and the realization that passengers had witnessed every moment. Several had risen in their seats. A man near the bulkhead stood halfway, camera in hand, still filming. Another leaned out from the aisle, disbelief etched on his face. Even the quiet hum of the cabin crew behind the curtain felt muted, as if the aircraft itself were holding its breath. "Sir," began a younger crew member rushing from the galley, his expression one of concern, his hands uncertain, hovering between apology and assistance. He bent slightly toward Arion, whispering, "Is there anything I can?" Arion lifted a single hand, palm outward, stopping him. His voice, when it came, was as calm as stone. "No, but I will need the crew incident log. Now." The attendant blinked, nodded quickly, and vanished toward the front. In the meantime, Naren took a small step back, trying to recover his posture. It was obstructing the aisle, he said, louder than necessary, addressing the passengers more than Arion. Could have posed a safety hazard. I had to move it. Arion didn't respond. Instead, he reached for his tablet and tapped the upper left corner twice. The screen flickered, then displayed a secure field interface. With a few silent swipes, he composed a message. Beside him, the passenger who had been recording knelt down discreetly and slid a folded slip of paper into Arion's hand. It was a QR code printed directly from his phone. Private cloud server. Encrypted. It's safe, the man whispered. Arion didn't look up. He simply nodded, unfolded the paper, scanned the code with his badge app, and attached it to a message already queued up. The recipient? His public relations director, Ethan Core. The message was 4 words long. Release if they lie. The front curtain parted. The purser leaned toward the cockpit, whispering urgently to the captain, whose eyes flicked toward the aisle. The pilot's jaw tightened as the purser handed him a second tablet showing the playback from the passenger's phone. Naren's actions played frame by frame. The captain rubbed his temples and muttered, "We're airborne, and this is already out of our hands." In the galley, Naren tried to recover ground, speaking to the second officer in hushed tones. He had his hair in the aisle. What was I supposed to do? Let trip someone? The second officer shook his head. There was nobody walking past him, he said firmly. And you didn't even say a word before grabbing him. You yanked it, Naren. That's not protocol. That's personal. Naren's face paled. Back in 1A, Arion opened the crew log handed to him and began writing. Every movement was deliberate, measured strokes on the page. Not a single muscle in his face showed anger or anxiety. Only focus. Beneath his fingers, he recorded time, details, and the nature of the assault with chilling precision. His handwriting was firm, controlled, a record for those who would soon need more than words to believe. A few seats back, another passenger murmured, "Is that really who I think it is?" "Yeah," someone whispered in return. "That's Arion Dresmor. Dravant Systems." The ripple began to build. The broken braid, symbolic, quiet, undeniable, rested in the crease of his suit like a warning left at sea level before a storm surge. The aircraft, cruising smoothly at 37,000 feet, had never felt so pressurized. Not from altitude, from truth. In the cockpit, the captain reviewed the footage one last time. He lowered the volume, but the image of Naren's hand yanking without hesitation was clear. The coiled braid flailed once, then dropped. The gasps, the silence that followed, the shame blooming too late on a man's face who thought his act would pass unnoticed. The captain looked toward the purser and said quietly, "The problem's not turbulence. It's the ripple when the wrong man pulls the wrong braid." The moment the aircraft wheels kissed the tarmac of Velmir International, a strange quiet settled over the first-class cabin. Not the usual hum of passengers unbuckling belts or flight attendants preparing for disembarkation, but a taut, loaded silence. Dr. Arion Dresmor sat still in seat 1A, his posture immaculate, his face composed, and his hands resting on a black document envelope resting on his lap. Inside it, folded with deliberate precision, was a severed braid, his own, and a QR code linking to the video that had already begun to ripple across the internet. Next to that, his handwritten incident notes, every line cataloged with legal precision. The cabin lights flickered to disembarkation mode. Naren Vask stood frozen halfway down the galley corridor, his eyes darting toward the front exit. His confident gait, once brimming with passive dominance, had collapsed into short, uncertain steps. The arrogance he wore during the flight had vanished, replaced by a sheen of panic on his forehead and a stiffness in his limbs that made him look more like a trapped animal than a crew member in charge. Arion rose slowly, smooth and unhurried, adjusting the cuffs of his charcoal blazer. As he stepped into the aisle, he caught the eye of the passenger who had filmed the assault, an older man with a weathered face, seated across the aisle. The man nodded once, firmly, and mouthed, "It's already out." The cabin doors hissed open. What waited on the other side wasn't the usual airport bustle. It was a wall of flashbulbs, microphones, and clipped footsteps echoing on the polished tile jet bridge. Uniformed airport security officers stood at attention, flanking two federal compliance agents in dark suits. A third man, holding a leather-bound folder stamped with the seal of the Aviation Ethics Board, leaned slightly forward to look inside the aircraft. Behind them, television crews jockeyed for angles, their lenses zooming and shuddering in bursts. Naren flinched and instinctively grabbed the handle of a nearby beverage cart, as if to shield himself. Arion didn't even glance at him. "This is it," whispered one crew member under his breath. "They're not here for the CEO." One of the officers stepped aboard with practice calm. "Naren Vask?" he asked, already knowing the answer. Naren's voice cracked. I need to speak with the captain first. This is a misunderstanding." The officer didn't blink. "Sir, you are being detained for questioning in connection with an onboard incident reported and substantiated by multiple passenger statements and live-streamed footage." A deep flush crawled up Naren's neck. His hands hovered near his badge as if he might offer it in defense. Instead, it was removed for him by another officer with white gloves, placed into an evidence pouch, and zipped away without ceremony. Arion remained silent, stepping carefully onto the jet bridge with the envelope clutched in one hand. The moment his polished shoes touched the ground, cameras exploded in his direction. Flashes flared like lightning. A young male journalist broke the noise first. "Dr. Dresmor, are you pressing charges?" he asked, his voice shaky but loud. Another added, "Is it true you were assaulted mid-flight over your hairstyle?" A third reporter, holding a long-range mic, said it loud enough for the entire bridge to hear, "This is the man whose code secures your skies." Arion stopped, turned slightly, and gave the cameras a clean profile view. The envelope remained unopened in his grip. The severed braid, once a symbol of quiet personal pride, now rested quietly within, a relic and a weapon. His eyes scanned the crowd, calm, measured, deadly in their stillness. Another reporter stepped forward. "Dr. Dresmor, do you have a statement?" For a moment, it seemed he might walk away. But then he turned to face the cameras squarely, his voice cutting through the air like the edge of a sharpened key. "He didn't pull my hair, he pulled his career out by the roots." The applause hadn't even fully died down when the breaking news banner splashed across the massive screens positioned around the Velmir Convention Hall. "CEO assaulted mid-flight. Incident goes viral." The words hit with the force of a thunderclap. Dozens of attendees froze mid-conversation. A few turned instinctively toward the main entrance, eyes wide, voices falling to murmurs. The summit's opening speaker, a veteran regulator from the European Aviation Commission, paused at the podium, his notes forgotten as the room shifted from structured protocol to unsettled energy. The air itself seemed to thin, as if the weight of what had happened on that flight had entered the room before the man at the center of it. Then the doors opened. Dr. Arion Dresmor stepped into the conference hall without hesitation. He walked with the composed silence of someone who had just endured public violation and transformed it into resolve. His charcoal gray suit was immaculate, the kind of executive tailoring that broadcast discipline and control. But it wasn't the suit that made the crowd fall silent. It was the coiled braid he carried in one hand, wrapped with a silver tie, resting against a leather-bound folio. His expression was unreadable. Calm, yes, but it was a calm forged in fire, the kind of stillness that preceded seismic change. As he crossed the hall, hundreds of eyes followed him, executives with polished smiles and secret boardroom fears, regulators who had memorized compliance clauses but never seen dignity weaponized so quietly, young engineers with notepads in hand. Even the live broadcast crew panned their cameras in reverent silence. Somewhere, a mic tech whispered to a producer, "We're not cutting this." And they didn't. Arion reached the podium. He set the folio down gently. Then, with deliberate motion, he placed the braid on the lectern. For a moment, it sat there alone, simple, silent, and impossible to ignore. The overhead lights caught the strands and made them gleam. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he scanned a room with the ease of a man who'd stood before boards, tribunals, and hostile press. But today was different. Today, he stood not to defend, not to explain, but to redefine. Before we talk about aviation ethics, Arion began, his voice clear and steady. Let's talk about the altitude of human dignity. The sentence landed like a gavel. No roar, no dramatics, just a controlled strike of truth. Several in the audience exhaled audibly. Others sat back as if bracing themselves. He continued, I boarded Flight 718 as a passenger, as a CEO, as a citizen. I disembarked as a symbol I did not volunteer to become, but one I refused to reject. A screen behind him flickered on, showing a muted freeze frame of the moment the braid was pulled. Arion didn't look at it. He didn't need to. He was the frame, and what he'd chosen to do with it had already changed the room. There are protocols for turbulence, he said, hands calmly folded. Oxygen masks for depressurization. Brace positions for impact. But there is no protocol for the quiet humiliation we allow when power and bias wear the same uniform. The audience leaned forward now. Every word had the weight of a closing door and the invitation of an open one. A few journalists near the back were furiously typing. Someone else discreetly wiped their eyes. Arion didn't pace. He didn't raise his voice. But every pause he took forced the room to sit with the silence he'd endured in seat 1A. Some of you have asked why I didn't retaliate, he said. Why I didn't return the gesture with the same force. And the answer is simple. I was never trained to fight fire with fire. I was trained to make the fire answer for its own spark. In the front row, a delegate from the Eastern Aviation Union lowered his gaze. Arion motioned gently to the braid. This was not a hairstyle. It was not a provocation. It was not an obstruction. It was part of me, pulled without permission, framed as policy. But policy without ethics is just power playing dress-up. He allowed the silence to settle. Not a chair moved. Even the conference staff stopped circulating coffee trays. Some of you have built aircraft that fly at Mach speed, Arion said, his tone narrowing into precision. But the question today is, how fast can you rebuild a culture once it breaks? The screen behind him shifted to a legal clause from the Passenger Rights Act, already under review by the Summit Committee. The clause read, physical contact with passenger identity markers requires clear necessity and consent. He didn't address it directly. He let the juxtaposition speak for itself. Then, without changing tone, he said, I'm not here for an apology. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because if silence is what allowed this, then presence is what will undo it. The screen darkened. Arion stepped back. He didn't smile. He didn't bow. He simply nodded once. The hall erupted into applause, not loud, not chaotic, but a wave of standing acknowledgement. It started slow, then more stood, then all. It wasn't just approval. It was recognition. Every hand clapping seemed to say, we saw it, we missed it, and we won't ignore it again. And as the final echoes of applause faded beneath the glass dome of the Velmir Convention Hall, Arion quietly stepped away from the microphone, leaving the coiled braid resting alone atop the lectern. You don't have to shout to shake a nation. Sometimes, all it takes is showing the thread they tried to cut. The moment the tribunal announcement hit Arion's inbox, he was already seated in a quiet conference room inside Dravant Systems' legal wing. The glass walls around him reflected the blue light of his tablet screen as Valen Cross, his lead legal strategist, stood at the head of the table, flipping through hard copies of personnel files. We got it, Valen said, setting one manila folder down with finality. 2 written warnings, both for physical boundary violations. And one just gone. No trace, no internal explanation. We only found it because an HR staffer made a duplicate backup by mistake. Arion didn't speak right away. His eyes scanned the scanned complaint, dated 6 months prior, detailing a near-identical incident involving Naren touching a male passenger's turban under the pretext of flight safety. The complaint was stamped, reviewed, but had never gone through formal disciplinary channels. Arion leaned back, braids coiled neatly behind his shoulders, his expression unreadable. But inside, something tightened. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was a pattern, one the airline had tried to erase. He looked at Valen. Draft a federal injunction. I want to freeze on all crew disciplinary log deletions from Alteron's database. Retroactive and immediate. Valen nodded, already typing. Arion knew exactly what he was doing. If they could prove systematic concealment of crew misconduct, it would pull the rot to the surface. The kind that no settlement could bury. Meanwhile, in a modest law office in East Velmir, retired Judge Eldrin Morell was watching the footage for the third time. He had been seated in 3A on Flight 718 and had witnessed every moment from 10 feet away. The tug, the snap, the silence that followed. He rubbed his temple and muttered, "Unbelievable." Within the hour, he had typed and notarized a sworn statement. "I've presided over hundreds of assault cases," it read. "What I saw on that plane was not protocol, it was prejudice. There was no stumble, no accident, no misjudgment, only intent." Back at Dravant HQ, Arion reviewed the statement, the silent rage in his chest now solidifying into purpose. Alteron's legal team had reached out privately, offering what they called a comprehensive goodwill settlement, along with a full retraction and a media-coached apology. The sum was generous. The conditions were clear: confidentiality, no tribunal, no public precedent. Arion didn't even finish the offer. He slid the tablet back across the table to Valen. "No," he said. Valen hesitated. "You're sure? I'm not here for a payout. I'm here so the next person doesn't have to start recording their own dignity just to survive a flight." Later that night, in a downtown suite wired for encrypted correspondence, Arion reviewed crew logs from the last 5 years. Valen's team had secured temporary access through a judicial order, just narrow enough to avoid triggering corporate panic, yet wide enough to see the pattern. Names had been quietly deleted, incident summaries shortened. Some verbal warnings had no witnesses listed. Others were tagged with case closed by supervisor discretion. But one stood out: Naren Vask. Same crew, different flight. The missing complaint wasn't the only one. Another had been filed by a regional manager in training who had since left the company. The accusation was chillingly similar, except that case had ended with a settlement and an NDA. The pattern was no longer anecdotal. It was institutional. The next morning, Arion stood before the courthouse clerk as his injunction filing was stamped and processed. He exited into the morning sun, the city of Velmir rising behind him, and felt the weight of both justice and burden. His face remained calm, but his voice, when he spoke to the waiting reporter, was iron. "They asked me to stay quiet, but you can't unpull what you never had the right to touch." The attendant smirked, certain his aggression would disappear into cabin silence, unaware that every camera, every witness, and every policy violation was already building the perfect storm against him. If you believe cruelty under a uniform always folds when strategy meets truth, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. The memo arrived like a lifeline tossed into a storm, but it only made the waves taller. Moments after Dr. Arion Dresmor's speech had ended and the echo of applause still lingered in the summit hall, a confidential document from Alteron Air's executive board was accidentally leaked to the media. It labeled the braid-pulling incident on Flight 718 as a grooming misunderstanding, a term so carelessly chosen it ignited a second inferno. Within 20 minutes, public reaction had turned from concern to open fury. Social media exploded with hashtags. Hashtag pulled by prejudice, hashtags with the braid, and hashtag not a grooming issue. Users posted side-by-side images of Arion's braid beside protest signs, captioned with words like "dignity is not a dress code." Commentators from legal, cultural, and aviation sectors began dissecting the language, calling it tone-deaf and a textbook example of corporate gaslighting. Inside the Situation Room at Dravant Systems HQ, Arion watched the coverage unfold without speaking. His face was unreadable, but his fingers tapped the edge of his tablet steadily. Each tap, a beat of controlled calculation. His chief legal advisor, Valen Cross, leaned forward, eyes sharp behind silver-framed glasses. "They just lit their own PR on fire," he muttered. Arion didn't look away from the screen. "Then we'll show them where the smoke leads." Minutes later, Arion's legal team filed an urgent petition requesting full access to Altron Air's internal communication logs and training archives. The request wasn't blind, it was targeted. Earlier that morning, a whistleblower had sent Arion's office a partially redacted screenshot from an internal crew group chat. In it, Naren Vask had written, "Let's see if this fancy braid guy thinks he's royalty up here." The timestamp was 15 minutes before boarding began. The implications were devastating. It proved intent, mockery dressed in uniform. Once the tribunal granted Arion's team provisional access to internal files under investigative privilege, what they uncovered struck deeper. Naren Vask had completed a bias training module 2 years prior, but the module had since been suspended. Not because it failed, but because it was flagged for reinforcing stereotypes instead of dismantling them. One internal review described it as a feedback loop of fear disguised as awareness. Worse still, employee evaluations revealed Naren had scored high on compliance, but low on adaptive empathy. Yet, he was cleared for passenger-facing roles. The paper trail was damning. That evening, while television anchors debated policy reform and Altron's stock price dipped by 12%, Arion sat at his office drafting a formal request to the National Passenger Rights Tribunal. He didn't request monetary damages. He didn't demand suspension of the airline's license. His request was chilling in its simplicity, a hearing to evaluate the institutional systems that trained, cleared, and defended Naren Vask. When his assistant asked if he wanted the airline itself penalized, Arion stood still for a moment, then turned, voice low and measured. "I want the system that gave him permission to act like that to answer for it. Why didn't you strike back?" The question landed with more weight than expected, cutting through the quiet tension that had overtaken the chamber. The tribunal hearing room, packed beyond its official capacity, felt utterly silent. The air was dense, thick with anticipation. Rows of sharply dressed aviation officials, federal regulators, journalists, and rival CEOs leaned forward, some holding their breath. At the front of the room, beneath a brass seal mounted on the dark-paneled wall, sat Dr. Arion Dresmor. He didn't answer right away. Seated upright in a deep mahogany chair, Arion's hands remained folded on the table before him, unmoving. The soft overhead lighting caught the edge of the coiled braid, resting beside a printed transcript of the incident. For a second, he allowed the silence to stretch, long enough to remind everyone this was not just about a viral video or a disgraced flight attendant. This was about a threshold. Then he spoke. "Because some of us weren't raised to react," Arion said, his voice firm but quiet. "We were raised to reform." The words did not roar. They didn't have to. Their gravity settled into the room like a gavel drop. A few tribunal members blinked slowly, one of them writing the quote verbatim into his notepad. In the back row, a journalist whispered it to his audio recorder reverently. The lead tribunal chair, Aldrich Venn, tapped his pen once and looked toward the airline's legal counsel. "Proceed." The defense team, a trio of suited men representing Altron Air, rose hesitantly. The eldest of the group, Counselor Darren Halvix, cleared his throat. "We acknowledge the emotional burden this incident placed on Dr. Dresmor," he began, voice tight with caution. "However, we must emphasize that flight attendant Naren Vask had been under immense work-related pressure. Our internal reports suggest he may have misjudged the proximity between himself and the passenger. There was no proven intent to—" "You've seen the video," Arion interrupted calmly. His tone didn't rise, but it cut with surgical precision. "And you've read your own deleted records." All eyes turned to the tribunal screen as it replayed the crucial footage. The high-definition angle, captured by a passenger's phone, clearly showed Naren gripping Arion's braid without provocation. The sound was muted, but the expressions were enough. Arion's composure, Naren's smirk, the other passenger's alarm. It was undeniable. When the lights came back on, no one moved. Counselor Halvix tried again. "Mr. Vask's prior record was clean." "Objection," said Valen Cross, Arion's lead strategist and legal advisor, rising swiftly. "That's incorrect. We've submitted proof that 2 previous complaints regarding Mr. Vask were dismissed without due process. Additionally, one complaint was fully deleted from Alteron's HR system 6 months ago, during Mr. Vask's final review cycle. He placed a sealed evidence folder on the table. A tribunal clerk took it up and delivered it to the panel. A hush fell again. Chairman Venn skimmed the folder's contents and frowned. Are these internal audit logs authentic? They're extracted directly from Alteron's redundancy backup server, Cross replied. We obtained them with proper clearance after Dr. Dresmor's injunction froze record deletion across their crew database. A murmur swept the room. Two officials in the second row whispered rapidly into their earpieces. Arion, still seated, didn't look at the folder. He didn't need to. His gaze remained fixed ahead. Tell us what that moment felt like, one tribunal member asked him, gesturing toward the braid, now resting beside the official tribunal seal. Arion turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable. I didn't feel pain, he said, not at first. I felt calculation. Someone tested the edge of what they thought they could get away with. He paused, then added, what snapped wasn't just the braid. It was the illusion that silence would keep us safe. The tribunal chamber, built for protocol and neutrality, began to feel like a court of reckoning. The setting itself, the polished floor, the brass accents, the echo of every voice, now amplified something deeper than procedure. It amplified memory. A junior member of the panel, barely 30, leaned forward. Do you believe this was personal? Arion considered this. No, he said slowly. It was institutional. It was permission. The kind that doesn't require anyone to say it out loud. It wears a name tag. It rides the system like a ghost, unpunished and unseen, until someone finally records it. This statement drew a visible reaction from several observers. One aviation CEO muttered to his colleague, "This changes our training standards." Immediately, the tribunal chair tapped his pen again. Dr. Dresmor, any final words? Arion reached into his briefcase and, with deliberate care, took out a small black velvet pouch. From it, he withdrew the same coiled braid, severed but preserved, and placed it directly beside the tribunal's crest. This isn't about hair, he said. It's about dignity that's been tugged one time too many. The verdict came swiftly. The tribunal's lead official adjusted his glasses, looked down at the findings, and announced, effective immediately, any physical contact with a passenger's cultural or personal identity marker without consent constitutes grounds for permanent disqualification from flight crew eligibility. The courtroom didn't erupt, but a palpable ripple passed through the seated officials, media observers, and airline representatives. The weight of the ruling settled into the room like gravity rediscovered. News of the landmark decision spread like wildfire. Within hours, 5 major carriers, Alteron included, scrambled to convene emergency policy meetings. Legal teams raced to revise crew training frameworks. PR executives crafted apologies, and executive boards tried to calculate what dignity, once ignored, might now cost. In Alteron's marble-paneled boardroom, a press release was drafted and approved, a formal apology to Dr. Arion Dresmor and all passengers affected by inadequate training and cultural insensitivity. The statement ended with an invitation for Dr. Dresmor to join their upcoming press conference as a guest of honor. He declined. Instead, Arion returned to Dravant Systems headquarters, a sleek tower of reflective glass overlooking the Velmere skyline. From the executive broadcast room on the 31st floor, he hosted a company-wide virtual town hall. Employees across 12 countries tuned in, their screens filled with the calm but piercing gaze of their CEO. I want to say something, Arion began, voice steady and measured. He held up a simple document envelope, the same one that had carried his coiled braid through customs. What they pulled wasn't a braid. It was the thread of patience, and that thread snapped for a reason. There was no applause, only silence. Respectful, alert silence. He went on to recount the events, not as a victim, but as a strategist dissecting a system failure. When silence is mistaken for submission, he said, sometimes the best response is to let the world listen to its own echo. Outside the corporate sphere, The video footage had exploded across platforms. 32 million views and counting. It had been translated into 12 languages and was now featured on legal blogs, aviation forums, and even sociology podcasts. Editorials titled "The Braid That Rewrote Policy" and "Accountability at 30,000 Feet" flooded mainstream media. Behind closed doors, Arion's legal team fielded calls from regulators and academics eager to cite the case in future compliance protocols. Arion, however, remained composed. He did not rush to claim victory. Instead, he studied the ruling, the reaction, and the ripple effects it caused. There was satisfaction, but it was quiet, controlled, precise. One evening, a junior analyst named Garen stepped into Arion's office hesitantly. "Sir," he said, holding a tablet, "someone just posted a clip of your speech at the summit side by side with the tribunal ruling. It's everywhere. People are calling it dignity-led disruption." Arion didn't look up. He simply nodded and replied, "Good. That means they're thinking." Later that week, an aviation magazine offered Arion its Leader of the Year award. He declined that too. For Arion, this was never about fame. It was about making sure what happened to him couldn't happen to someone quieter, someone without a satellite uplink or a legal team on standby. He knew the real work would begin now: implementation, enforcement, and permanence. That night, as rain fell gently on the Dravant Tower's upper decks, Arion stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, watching the red-eye flights rise and disappear into the clouds. Somewhere up there, policy had changed. Somewhere up there, respect had been written into law. He turned to his chief of staff, Valen Cross, who had just entered with a printout of the tribunal transcript. "It's done," Valen said softly. Arion's response was almost a whisper, but his words hit with the weight of thunder. What they pulled wasn't a braid. It was the thread of patience, and that thread snapped for a reason. Naren Vast's video apology was released at 9:04 a.m. the following Monday. In it, he appeared in a dimly lit room, seated stiffly before a blank wall. He wore a wrinkled uniform shirt with no name tag, and his hands remained clasped together on the desk before him. "I deeply regret my actions aboard Flight 718, he began, his voice flat, eyes barely meeting the camera lens. "It was never my intention to cause harm or discomfort to any passenger." But his delivery lacked remorse. Online viewers noticed immediately. Within minutes, the video comment section flooded with outrage, parody reactions, and side-by-side comparisons with the original cabin footage. One viral comment read, "You regret getting caught. Not what you did." The apology did not soften the blow. In fact, it made things worse. That same afternoon, the tribunal's official disqualification order was posted publicly. Naren Vast was permanently barred from working aboard any commercial airline operating under federal regulation. As the news spread, more layers of Naren's past began to unravel. A freelance investigative journalist named Jornal Cray published a thread on social media exposing discrepancies in Naren's employment history. Cray had obtained internal Altron Air documents through a whistleblower and discovered that Naren had edited several personnel review files, masking two serious complaints. One involved inappropriate conduct toward passenger. The other cited unsanctioned physical contact during an in-flight confrontation 5 years earlier. Both had mysteriously vanished from the company's main HR database. The tribunal's ruling, however, had triggered something deeper than a career collapse. It became a lever that pried open a sealed vault of HR malpractice at Altron. Inside the airline's corporate tower in Havre District, panic simmered behind closed glass. 3 high-ranking HR executives, Director Melrick Van, Deputy Lead Oren Salvek, and Ethics Coordinator Bren Furlow, were called into an emergency compliance session. Each had signed off on performance evaluations that had cleared Naren for service despite his record. Surveillance logs and email threads, some barely concealed, revealed how the team had coordinated to preserve the reputation of crew integrity by burying past misconduct. By the end of the week, all 3 quietly resigned. But while Altron tried to cauterize its internal wound, Arion Dresmor moved in the opposite direction. He didn't disappear into boardrooms, or let PR statements do the talking. He acted. Threadline was announced with zero fanfare. No press conference. No slogan. Just a clean, black website with one sentence in white font. Cultural dignity shouldn't need turbulence to be noticed. Funded directly from Arion's own post-acquisition liquidity reserve, Threadline was launched as a passenger rights initiative focused on respect, representation, and reform in aviation. Its first project was the development of a virtual reality training module created in partnership with a coalition of behavioral psychologists and former flight directors. The simulation included real-world scenarios, not stylized hypotheticals. One module placed trainees in the shoes of a passenger with braided hair being inspected aggressively during boarding. Another forced the crew member to interact with a deaf passenger while juggling emergency procedures. The emphasis wasn't just on inclusion. It was on ethical calibration, training that identified unconscious bias before it could evolve into irreversible action. Arion personally oversaw the development team, reviewing scripts, adjusting dialogue, and insisting on realism. At one late-night test run in Dravant's simulation lab, an engineer asked why he was so meticulous about minor gestures, like the motion of a flight attendant brushing too close to a passenger's shoulder. Arion simply replied, because they call it a microaggression, but the damage is always macro. Within 2 weeks, 4 regional carriers reached out to license the VR program. By the end of the month, Threadline had secured memoranda of understanding with 7 more. Industry insiders began referring to the movement as the Threadline standard. But as momentum grew, so did resistance. A pilot union executive accused Threadline of weaponizing discomfort. A retired airline CEO wrote a column arguing that not every interaction should be policed. Arion did not respond. He didn't need to. The numbers spoke for themselves. Passenger satisfaction ratings on pilot testing routes spiked by 19%. Complaints dropped, and media outlets shifted their tone from controversy to case study. In an exclusive sit-down interview aired on the night of Threadline's first formal adoption by a major airline, the anchor asked Arion, "Why the name Threadline?" He paused, looked down for a second, then back at the camera. His expression was thoughtful but firm. Because even a thread can tether a movement. The interview closed on that line, played over a montage of airport terminals, aircrafts lifting into dawn skies, and uniformed crew members taking part in new training sessions. A voiceover recited the line one last time, now etched into the campaign's foundation. In the wreckage of silence, he built policies loud enough to echo at 30,000 feet. The glass case clicked softly as Arion placed it on the podium. A severed braid lay inside, coiled like a symbol, not of shame, but of quiet resistance. The overhead lights of the Global Aviation Reform Assembly Hall gleamed off the case's surface, catching the eyes of delegates from 42 nations. Arion Dresmor did not wait for an introduction. He simply stepped forward, adjusted the microphone with steady fingers, and began to speak. "This," he said, voice calm but resonant, "isn't a symbol of pain." The room, a grand space brimming with seasoned regulators, tech executives, and federal aviation delegates, had fallen into silence the moment he arrived. Just hours ago, whispers had swirled through the corridors, rumors that the CEO of Dravant Systems, the man at the heart of the now global ethics reform wave, would not attend. And yet here he was, standing straight in a tailored Navy suit, his newly regrown braid resting confidently down one shoulder. Arion exuded not just authority, but unshakable composure. His presence was a paradox, soft in movement, yet impossible to ignore. "I was never meant to make a speech here," he continued. "I came to share code, algorithms, simulations, but something else made its way into the airspace before I could." He paused. His eyes swept the audience, not challengingly, but searchingly. His legal team had advised restraint. His advisors had offered alternative speakers. But Arion had chosen none of them. He had not come to confront or accuse. He had come to anchor the moment in truth. "The braid you see behind this glass," he said, gesturing, "was torn from my scalp by a man in uniform. Not in combat. Not in riot. but in first class, mid-flight, while I was reading a compliance brief. Gasps rippled from the far side of the room. A few heads dropped. Others leaned forward, visibly unsure whether to recoil in shame or admiration. But Arion didn't flinch. The images from Flight 718 had already gone viral months ago. What mattered now was not retelling the facts, but reshaping the outcome. What followed, he said slowly, was not an outrage campaign. It was not retaliation. I pressed no hand into a fist. Y demanda no pudium. But I documented everything. And I waited. His voice hardened just slightly on that last word. Waited for justice. Waited for accountability. Waited for a platform like this one. A prominent delegate from the Norvan Alliance leaned toward his interpreter and asked in hushed tones, "He still kept flying after that?" Arion noticed, and answered anyway. "Yes, I kept flying, because fear should never have clearance to ground dignity." The translator stumbled, not from difficulty, but emotion. As Arion continued, he shared how his company, Dravant Systems, had quietly begun embedding their AI monitoring tools into airport body cams across 6 international terminals. Unlike traditional surveillance, these systems carried optional emotion recognition overlays, designed not to accuse, but to alert. Not to replace humans, but to assist them in noticing harm before harm escalated. He did not mention revenge. He mentioned responsibility. "Our tools don't punish," Arion said, clicking to a live demo feed on the screen behind him. "They remember, so that no one has to choose between silence and scandal." The audience was rapt now, not only because of the technology, but because of the man delivering it. He didn't push blame. He didn't boast. But every sentence, measured, slow, deliberate, carried more force than a raised voice ever could. A foreign policy director from Varelli stood. "Dr. Dresmor," he asked, "what compelled you to return to this industry after what it did to you?" Arion didn't hesitate. His answer was quiet, but absolute. "Because some of us weren't stitched together by comfort. We were stitched by consequence. And when something unravels, we don't walk away, we sew it stronger." Several delegates blinked quickly, pretending dust had gotten into their eyes. A few took notes with trembling hands. The moderator looked as though he'd forgotten a brief. Arion ended not with a call to action, but with a reminder, one that needed no amplification. He stepped forward once more, lifted the glass case gently, and held it aloft. "This," he said, "isn't a symbol of pain. It's proof that calm can cut deeper than rage and rebuild better." The dedication plaque gleamed under the afternoon lights the moment Arion stepped into the redesigned Alcheron lounge. He paused just inside the threshold, his footsteps soft against the polished floor as the air shifted around him, quiet but heavy with meaning. The plaque stood at eye level, mounted on a brushed steel column near the entrance. Its inscription caught his attention first, in honor of Dr. Arion Dresmor, whose silence was louder than injustice. Below those words, a delicate metal engraving of a coiled braid shimmered faintly, as if the room itself understood the weight of what had happened 1 year earlier. Arion exhaled slowly. He hadn't planned to linger, but the sight rooted him in place, pulling him back into memories he had carefully folded away. The lounge, now renamed the Threadline Room, had transformed entirely from its old design. Soft amber lights washed over the curved walls, and long glass panels displayed rotating quotes on dignity, respect, and passenger safety, none of them loud, all of them firm. Rows of seats had been replaced with workshop pods and open spaces used for training. The atmosphere carried the quiet energy of rebuilding, like an aircraft repaired with new parts but still honoring the journey that led to its reconstruction. He stepped deeper into the room, unnoticed for a moment as a tour of new crew members entered through a side doorway. The facilitator, a tall man with neat silver hair, spoke with a voice that balanced authority and gentleness. "This lounge was redesigned after a landmark case," he explained. "A reminder that dignity is not optional at 30,000 feet. Arion drifted toward the far corner, choosing a spot beside a frosted pane glass panel. He didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. Instead, he watched the tour continue, observing the way the trainees leaned forward, their eyes fixed on every detail. One trainee in particular, young, maybe early 20s, posture straight but expression earnest, walked slightly ahead of the group. He paused abruptly when he reached the plaque. The others continued past, but the young man stood motionless, staring at the engraved braid as if it carried a heartbeat. Arion's attention sharpened. He watched the trainee lift a hand, stopping just short of touching the metal. The man's voice dropped to a whisper. I remember this story. Every word was coated with both reverence and resolve, the kind that hinted at a future leader shaped by a moment he never lived through but deeply understood. His eyes glistened with the awareness that he was stepping into a system forever changed by someone else's courage. Arion felt something shift in his chest, a subtle tightening followed by relief. He hadn't fought for applause. He hadn't fought for headlines. He had fought for this, a young man who would carry the lesson forward without being told twice. Without turning, the trainee rejoined the group, his pace steadier, his shoulders set with newfound purpose. Arion stepped back from the wall, his reflection faint in the polished surface of the plaque. For a brief moment, he saw not a CEO, not a public figure, but a man who had chosen restraint when the world expected anything but. That memory rustled through him like a quiet wing beat. He walked toward the exit without interrupting the tour. His movements were calm, but his mind processed the subtle tension of the moment, an echo of the past intertwined with a promise for the future. Before stepping out, he cast one last glance at the plaque. The engraved braid seemed to curve like a path rather than a symbol, hinting that the story was not an ending, but a threshold. The door slid open with a low hiss as he stepped into the concourse. The sky beyond a large terminal windows was clear, washed in faint gold from the descending sun. Aircraft lifted gently into the air, leaving trails of silver arcs that caught the light. Each ascent felt quieter, steadier, as if the sky itself acknowledged the reforms that now protected those who traveled under it. Arion tucked his hands into his coat pockets, breathing in the cool terminal air. No interviews, no announcements, no attention, just a man walking forward, knowing he had steered something far larger than a single flight. He took one last look toward the threadline room and allowed a faint, private smile to form before turning away. Outside, the sky was clear, the planes rose without turbulence, and dignity flew higher than any aircraft. He never boarded that flight for a fight, but he landed with the sky in his hands. By landing, the footage had spread to every platform, and the attendant's arrogance crumbled under millions of eyes. The CEO's calm response triggered investigations, suspensions, and a media tidal wave the airline couldn't escape. If you believe real authority strikes with precision and exposes injustice without a single misstep, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights prejudice, abuse of authority, and the power of exposure and accountability in confronting wrongdoing. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, justice, and respect for every passenger.